In the sweltering August of 1943, a train, its cars packed with soldiers of the defeated German Afrika Korps, moved sluggishly through the unfamiliar landscape of central Louisiana. For these men, recently transferred from the arid battlefields of Tunisia, the view from the windows was a disorienting tableau of dense, endless pine forests and wetlands shimmering under a oppressive, humid heat. Their heavy woolen uniforms were soaked with sweat, a miserable, clinging dampness far removed from the dry heat of the desert. One prisoner would later confide to his diary that disembarking from that train felt like stepping directly into a blazing furnace. This was their new reality. Camp Claiborne, situated near Alexandria, a place where nearly 3,000 German POWs were destined to see the war through to its conclusion. During their Atlantic crossing, their officers had prepared them for the worst, reinforcing years of relentless Nazi propaganda. They had been told to expect barbaric treatment at the hands of the Americans, portrayed as a decadent, mongrel nation ruled by a sinister alliance of Jewish financiers and gangsters. Sinister rumors circulated by the SS spoke of Americans extracting gold teeth from the corpses of prisoners. These young men, some barely out of their teens, others seasoned career soldiers of the Wehrmacht, marched through the camp gates braced for a descent into hell, anticipating torture, starvation, and brutal forced labor. What they encountered, however, was so profoundly disconcerting that it defied all their expectations. Instead of snarling guards and barbed wire, they saw American soldiers who appeared almost nonchalant, leaning against structures and smoking. The barracks, while simple, were equipped with actual beds and mattresses, a stark contrast to the concrete floors or straw piles they had imagined. The mess halls served portions so generous that they surpassed the rations many had subsisted on during the final, desperate months in North Africa. Decades later, a Bavarian corporal named Joseph would vividly recall his first meal: mashed potatoes, beef stew, fresh white bread, authentic coffee, and a crisp apple. The sheer normalcy and quality of the food was so emotionally overwhelming that he nearly broke down in tears. By the time Rommel's army collapsed in Tunisia, German rations had been reduced to little more than hardtack and scavenged tinned fish. The true psychological shockwave, however, arrived a few days later. A U.S. Army lieutenant assembled a group of new arrivals to outline the camp's regulations. Through an interpreter, he detailed the mundane routines, roll call schedules, work details, and restricted areas. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned recreational privileges. On specified afternoons, the prisoners would be permitted access to the camp's facilities. This included, the lieutenant stated with no particular emphasis, supervised swimming in the local waterways of Rapides Parish. The translator paused, certain he had misheard. Swimming? The American officer confirmed it. Yes, they would be allowed to swim in the very same rivers where local families cooled off on summer days. A former schoolteacher from Hamburg later attempted to articulate the profound sense of psychological vertigo that moment induced. These men had surrendered, fully anticipating the kind of death camps or slave labor that their own nation was inflicting upon Soviet prisoners in the East. Instead, their captors were offering them what amounted to a leisure activity. This single act shattered the entire foundational narrative of how enemies were supposed to behave in wartime. Some suspected a cruel trick. Perhaps the guards planned to shoot them in the water and claim they were attempting to escape. Others believed it was a temporary performance for the benefit of Red Cross inspectors. Not one of them could have guessed the simple truth. This was not special treatment, but standard operating procedure for American POW camps. The first time a group of prisoners was actually marched down to a designated swimming area under the watch of a handful of bored-looking American guards, a palpable tension hung in the air. They were waiting for the trap to be sprung. The Caucasia River and other smaller streams near the camps became regular destinations for recreation throughout late 1943 and into 1944. Guards would escort groups of 20 or 30 POWs to these spots during the most oppressive heat of the late afternoon. The Americans carried their rifles, but they were often slung casually over shoulders as the guards sat in the shade, occasionally glancing up from their magazines or newspapers. The unspoken message was clear: maintain order, and there would be no trouble. Then the local civilians began to appear. Mothers with their children, groups of teenagers, elderly couples. They would arrive at these same riverbanks, spread out their blankets, and wade into the water, often within shouting distance of the enemy soldiers. The initial encounters were fraught with uncertainty for the Germans. Was this a provocation? A test of their discipline? Some prisoners instinctively swam back toward their guards, fearing accusations of fraternization or preparing to take hostages. The guards would simply wave them off. "Relax," one sergeant was known to say. "It's a big river. There's enough room for everybody." What the POWs found most difficult to comprehend was the utterly casual nature of these interactions. American children splashed and laughed mere meters away from soldiers who had, until recently, been wearing the uniform of the Third Reich. Fathers taught their sons to swim while German prisoners floated on their backs nearby. One POW, a man named Klaus from Stuttgart, remembered a young American boy, no older than 7, swimming right up to him and asking in broken German if he was truly from Germany. The boy wanted to know if Klaus had ever seen the Rhine River. For 5 minutes, a homesick soldier and a curious child conversed about rivers before the boy's mother called him back to their blanket. There was no fear, no hysteria, just a simple, human moment transcending the context of war. This privilege of swimming was not universal across all camps, and it was certainly not publicized on the home front, where Americans might have resented the idea of enemy prisoners enjoying leisure while their own sons died on battlefields in Europe. Yet across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, this scene repeated itself throughout 1944 and 1945. Camp authorities had pragmatically discovered that prisoners who received regular recreation were less prone to trouble, more manageable, and maintained higher morale. It was a practical solution, not an ideological one. For the German prisoners, however, the experience was transformative. These swimming holes were not merely places to cool off. They were daily, living proof that everything they had been taught about America was a monstrous lie. The propaganda had depicted a weak, fractured, and criminal society. Instead, they were witnessing ordinary people living peaceful, ordinary lives, and treating them, the captured enemy, with a mixture of cautious respect and basic human decency. Otto, a former tank commander, later reflected that those afternoons in the Louisiana rivers did more to deconstruct his indoctrination than any denazification lecture ever could. He realized that a society confident enough to let its children swim alongside its enemies was a society that was fundamentally unafraid. The foundation for this unexpectedly humane treatment was not rooted in a particular American kindness or progressive idealism, but in cold, hard law. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and the Roosevelt administration made a strategic decision to adhere to its provisions meticulously. This was not purely altruistic. American officials were acutely aware that hundreds of thousands of U.S. servicemen were held in German POW camps. By scrupulously following the Geneva rules, the U.S. government created diplomatic leverage, providing a credible basis to demand reciprocal treatment for its own captured soldiers. It was a form of insurance policy, codified in international law. The 1929 Convention was remarkably specific in its requirements. Prisoners were to be housed in conditions equivalent to those of the captor nation's own base troops. They were guaranteed adequate food, with rations matching the quantity and quality of those given to depot troops. The treaty mandated payment for labor, with enlisted men earning 80 cents a day in camp scrip usable at the canteen, while officers could not be compelled to work. It also guaranteed access to recreational facilities, religious services, and postal communication. Even the seemingly bizarre swimming privileges fell squarely under Article 17's stipulation for physical exercise and sports. For Germans steeped in tales of American barbarism, this created a powerful and persistent cognitive dissonance. Heinrich, an infantryman from Saxony, described his first month at Camp Ruston in northern Louisiana as mentally destabilizing. His days began with a breakfast of eggs and toast, followed by light forestry work, a hot lunch, and afternoons free for reading or sports. Meanwhile, through censored but penetrating letters, he knew that Soviet prisoners in German camps were dying by the thousands from starvation and systematic neglect. The asymmetry was staggering. How could the same war contain such diametrically opposed realities? How could one side view captives as protected persons under law, while the other viewed them as subhuman objects to be worked to death? American officers sometimes explain this disparity as a matter of civilization, not in a boastful sense, but as a practical framework. The U.S. viewed the Geneva Conventions as a mutual pact between civilized nations. You protect our men, we protect yours, and all militaries benefit from the knowledge that surrender does not equal a death sentence. This policy yielded tangible strategic benefits. By mid-1944, German soldiers on the Western Front were surrendering in droves, partly because word had filtered back through the ranks that American captivity was not only survivable, but tolerable, even comfortable in comparison to the front lines. The policy was functioning exactly as designed. Life within the camps further deepened this dissonance. Camp canteens sold cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and even musical instruments. POWs could purchase American beer, real beer, not a substitute, up to 3 bottles per week. They organized orchestras, theater troupes, and highly competitive soccer leagues. Camp Claiborne even supported a prisoner-run newspaper by 1944. The irony was inescapable. Many prisoners realized they were living better in American captivity than many civilians in war-rationed America, and certainly better than their own families in bombed-out German cities. One prisoner, in a letter carefully vetted by censors, described his diet to his family in Hamburg, who were surviving on turnips and black bread. He was eating pork chops and ice cream. The war, he wrote, had ceased to make any logical sense when viewed from inside the wire of an American POW camp. The scale of this operation expanded dramatically through 1944. A network of labor camps spread across the American South, and German POWs became an indispensable pillar of the region's wartime economy. Main camps like Claiborne, Ruston, and Livingston served as administrative hubs, but the real work occurred at hundreds of smaller branch camps attached to farms, forests, and processing plants. The American home front was suffering a critical labor shortage, with workers having enlisted or moved to northern factories. Crops like cotton and sugarcane needed harvesting, timber needed cutting, and crawfish needed processing. Into this void stepped approximately 50,000 German POWs across the southern states. The Geneva Convention explicitly permitted the use of prisoner labor in agriculture, so former Africa Corps veterans who had once manned 88mm guns found themselves driving tractors through Louisiana cotton fields. Mechanics from the Wehrmacht operated sawmills, and Luftwaffe ground crews harvested sweet potatoes. They earned their 80 cents a day, while the farmers paid the U.S. government the standard local wage, with the government retaining the difference. This economic arrangement had an unintended consequence. It rapidly broke down the abstract concept of the enemy. On family farms, the POWs ceased to be faceless Nazis and became individuals. Fritz, Hans, and Werner, the men who had helped repair a broken tractor or who efficiently cleared a field. Farmers' wives would bring lunch out to everyone, and German prisoners, American guards, and local workers would eat together. Language barriers initially caused comic misunderstandings, but over time, functional English was acquired by the prisoners, and some Southerners picked up snippets of German. The economic dependency was profound. Louisiana's crucial 1944 sugarcane harvest and East Texas's timber industry would have faltered without this POW labor. One farmer admitted privately that his German workers were more disciplined and reliable than any local labor he had ever hired. The ultimate irony was palpable. America was fighting a brutal war against Germany and Europe while simultaneously relying on German soldiers to sustain its domestic agricultural economy. This economic integration accelerated a process of humanization. When your livelihood depends on someone's labor, it becomes difficult to sustain abstract hatred. Farmers began to trust certain prisoners, sometimes even driving them into town for supplies. Escape attempts were remarkably rare. Fewer than 2,000 out of nearly 400,000 German POWs nationwide ever tried. The incentive to flee was low. Why run from a situation of safety, adequate food, and relative freedom to an unknown fate in a foreign country, especially when the alternative was likely death on the front lines or brutal captivity in the Soviet Union? The cultural exchange that flourished in this environment extended far beyond the economic sphere. It wove the prisoners into the very social fabric of rural Southern life in ways unimaginable elsewhere. Shared religious faith provided the first bridge. Many POWs were Catholic or Lutheran, and the deeply religious communities of the South responded. By late 1943, prisoners were being allowed, under guard, to attend Sunday services at local churches. St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Alexandria regularly had German POWs occupying designated pews while armed guards stood at the back. After the service, the churchwomen often invited both guards and prisoners to share in potluck lunches in the parish hall. These gatherings revealed a simple, powerful truth that propaganda on both sides had sought to obscure. At their core, people are just people. A Louisiana schoolteacher named Margaret, whose husband was serving in the Pacific, befriended several musically talented POWs from a nearby forestry camp. She organized a concert for them at the local high school in the spring of 1944. The program featured works by Beethoven, Schubert, and Bach. The auditorium was filled with American families sitting in respectful silence as the enemy soldiers performed the classical music of their homeland. When the last note faded, the audience applauded warmly. One of the violinists, a man from Munich, was seen with tears streaming down his face. He later told Margaret it was the first time in years he felt like a human being again, not just a soldier or a prisoner. Skills became a currency of connection. German prisoners taught local youths wood carving. A former glassblower from Bavaria crafted intricate figurines to trade for small comforts. They built furniture, repaired clocks, and in one instance, helped construct a community playground. While such private commerce was technically forbidden, guards and commanders often turned a blind eye, recognizing the mutual benefits. A German carpenter might build a hope chest for a farmer's daughter in exchange for a homemade pecan pie and real coffee. These were not merely transactions. They were gestures of shared humanity. Language exchange happened organically. Guards taught English to pass the time during long watches. Prisoners taught German to curious local children who gathered by the fences. Some camps developed informal tutoring systems. Guards participated earnestly, thinking that knowledge of German might prove valuable if they were deployed to Europe. The prisoners, in turn, absorbed American slang, learned to distinguish regional accents, and became conversant in the rules of baseball. The most profound interactions were often the quietest. A German medic assisting a local doctor during an emergency, a former engineer sketching plans to improve a farmer's irrigation, a young prisoner from Hamburg teaching a Louisiana boy how to make potato pancakes using sweet potatoes. These moments, insignificant in the grand sweep of the war, accumulated into a vast reservoir of shared experience and mutual respect, fundamentally altering perceptions on both sides of the fence. While this remarkable story was unfolding in the American South, a starkly different, horrifying reality was dominating the war in Eastern Europe. The contrast was not merely a difference in degree, but in kind. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Nazi Germany, an estimated 3.3 million perished, a mortality rate of nearly 58%. They died from systematic starvation, exposure, disease, and outright execution, victims of a Nazi ideology that deemed them Untermenschen, subhumans. The Soviet response was one of brutal reciprocity. Of the roughly 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, about 1 million died in captivity, a 35% mortality rate involving forced labor in Siberian gulags, starvation rations, and vengeful treatment. This grim context lived in the minds of the German soldiers in Louisiana. Many had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred to Africa or Italy. They had witnessed, or participated in, the brutalization of Soviet POWs. For them, the experience of American captivity was psychologically seismic. A former sergeant named Kurt, who had fought at Stalingrad, described it as living in two parallel universes. He had seen Soviet prisoners starve and freeze to death in makeshift enclosures near the Volga. Less than 2 years later, he was eating 3 square meals a day in Louisiana and being paid for light work. The asymmetry was morally confounding. American camps featured infirmaries with proper medical care, often staffed by captured German doctors using American supplies. When a measles outbreak hit Camp Claiborne, a quarantine was established and all prisoners received treatment. Every single one recovered. Meanwhile, epidemics of typhus and dysentery were decimating POW populations in the East. This disparity forced a painful reckoning. Some prisoners were racked with survivor's guilt. They were safe, well-fed, and secure while their comrades were being annihilated on the Eastern Front or suffering unimaginable horrors in Soviet camps, and while their families back home endured relentless bombing and deprivation. American authorities sometimes use this stark contrast in subtle re-education efforts, showing photographs from liberated German camps in the East to the POWs. The implicit message was powerful. This is what your government sanctioned. This is the brutality we have chosen not to inflict upon you. For some hardliners, the images were dismissed as propaganda. For others, it was a moment of devastating clarity, the final collapse of the ideological fortress they had lived within. They had served a regime that treated human life as expendable, while being held captive by a nation that adhered to a framework of international law and basic decency. With the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, the swimming excursions ceased, but the story was far from over. Repatriation was a slow process, stretched out over months and years due to logistical nightmares in the devastated state of post-war Germany. Many POWs remained in American camps until 1946, and some until 1947. During this prolonged limbo, the bonds formed in Louisiana and elsewhere only deepened. The prisoners were no longer unknown enemies. They were familiar faces, known for their skills and their characters. Then something extraordinary began to happen. They started to return. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, a significant number of former German POWs immigrated back to the American South, particularly to Louisiana. While precise numbers are elusive, estimates run into the thousands. Some returned to marry local women they had met. Others were drawn back by the memory of decent treatment and the economic opportunity that a recovering America offered, which stood in sharp contrast to the ruins of their homeland. A man named Hermann, who had worked on a sugarcane plantation, returned in 1948 with his German bride, bought land from his former employer, and became a successful farmer in his own right. These returnees often visited the old swimming holes with their new American families, recounting the surreal story of how they, as enemy prisoners, had first encountered American decency in those very waters. They brought with them skills that enriched their communities, German engineering applied to farming, European craftsmanship merging with American enterprise. A former Luftwaffe mechanic opened a renowned auto shop in Shreveport. A Bavarian baker established a successful bakery in New Orleans. The motivation for their return was more than just economic. It was the enduring memory of being treated as a human being when they had expected to be treated as subhuman. A man named Johann, who settled in Monroe, Louisiana, later expressed it simply, "In Germany, I was just another soldier. In a Soviet camp, I would have been just another corpse. But here in Louisiana, even as a prisoner, people learned my name. They saw me as a person. That kind of thing stays with you forever. The legacy of the Louisiana swimming holes is a quiet one, largely erased from the national memory. There are no monuments and few history book chapters dedicated to this peculiar footnote of the war. Yet its lessons resonate with profound urgency. It demonstrates the ultimate fragility of propaganda when confronted with consistent, tangible reality. No amount of Nazi indoctrination could withstand the daily evidence of American decency embodied by a simple swim in the river. It highlights the strategic wisdom of adhering to international law and humane principles. The U.S. policy, rooted in the Geneva Conventions, was a brilliant strategic calculation that encouraged surrender, protected American POWs, and ultimately helped turn former enemies into allies and even citizens. This stands in stark contrast to modern dilemmas surrounding detention and interrogation, where departures from these principles have often resulted in lasting moral and strategic damage. Furthermore, it underscores the power of economic and social integration to dismantle hatred. When people are brought together by mutual need and proximity, abstract ideologies of enmity crumble in the face of shared experience. The farmers of Louisiana needed the labor of the German POWs, and that need forged relationships that transcended the war. The rivers of Louisiana still flow today. Families still swim in them on hot afternoons, largely unaware of the profound historical echoes that ripple just beneath the surface of the water. The story of the German POWs and the American swimming holes is a powerful testament to a simple, enduring truth: that enemies can become neighbors, and humanity can prevail even in the midst of war, but only if we create the spaces, both physical and moral, for it to happen. This lesson, born in the humid air of a Louisiana summer, costs nothing to remember, but its forgetting comes at an incalculable price. This process of return and integration created a subtle but enduring German cultural thread in the fabric of Louisiana and other southern states. The returnees did not form isolated, insular communities. Instead, they assimilated, weaving their heritage into the local culture. The Louisiana German accent that can still be faintly heard in some rural parishes is not just from 19th century immigrants. Its more modern inflections were shaped by these post-war arrivals. They established German-American clubs not as bastions of separatism, but as bridges, hosting Oktoberfest celebrations that became, and remain, key local events where schnitzel and jambalaya are served side by side. Their presence also served as a living, breathing counter-narrative during the early, tense years of the Cold War. As the Iron Curtain descended and the Soviet Union became the new existential threat, these former POWs were tangible proof of the fundamental difference between the American and Soviet systems. They had personally experienced the chasm between a society that followed rules of war and one that engaged in total, annihilating brutality. Some became vocal advocates for their new nation, their personal stories serving as potent, first-hand testimony against totalitarianism. Others lived their anti-communism more quietly, simply by being productive citizens and raising families in the land of their former captivity. The children of these returning POWs grew up with a unique dual identity. They were fully American, yet carried with them the stories and traditions of their fathers' pasts. They learned that their existence was, in a way, a direct consequence of a policy of decency. The family narrative was not one of heroic battle, but of a surprising redemption found in the most unlikely of places, a prisoner of war camp in the Deep South. This legacy often instilled in them a profound appreciation for the complexities of history and a skepticism toward simplistic propaganda. Back in a now divided Germany, the experiences of these returning soldiers also had a subtle but significant impact. The America Lager stories became a distinct genre of wartime memory. While some hardened Nazis returned embittered and dismissive of American softness, a great many others brought back a more nuanced view. They spoke of the fairness, the abundance, and the strange, disarming normality of American life. These accounts circulated in a Germany that was being rebuilt under American supervision through the Marshall Plan. The credibility of these witnesses, fellow soldiers who had seen the front lines, lent weight to the idea that cooperation with the former enemy was not only necessary but could be productive and based on mutual respect. In this way, the seeds of the post-war transatlantic alliance were not only sown by politicians in Washington and Bonn, but were also prefigured in the shared experiences of guards and prisoners in the Louisiana heat. The infrastructure of the camps themselves faded back into the landscape. The wooden barracks were dismantled, their lumber repurposed for local homes and barns. The parade grounds were reclaimed by pine forests or converted into industrial sites. Today, only historical markers, often placed by local historical societies rather than federal agencies, hint at what once was. The true monuments are not made of stone or metal. They are the family names on mailboxes, the bakeries with German recipes, and the shared features of grandchildren who carry the bloodlines of both Louisiana natives and men from the Rhineland or Bavaria. The philosophical implications of this forgotten history are vast. It challenges the simplistic, Hollywood-driven narrative of World War II as an unambiguously good war by introducing a profound moral complexity. It forces us to ask, what does true strength look like? Is it the capacity for utter destruction of one's enemy? Or is it the confidence to exercise restraint and uphold principles even when it would be easier, and perhaps more emotionally satisfying, to do otherwise? The American decision to follow the Geneva Convention to the letter was an exercise in a specific kind of power. The power of law, the power of long-term strategy, and the power of moral example.